Caught my wife cheating and accidentally destroyed her affair partner's marriage in the process. I wasn't supposed to come home early. We had this Vineyard B&B honeymoon suite booked for the weekend and everything. But work was slow, so I figured I'd surprise her. Instead, I got the surprise of a lifetime when I found some random guy's truck in my driveway. What happened next led me to expose not just my wife's affair, but also reveal to his wife that her husband had been lying about being single. The whole thing spiraled into this comedy of errors where everyone's secrets came crashing down at once. Let me tell you how one unexpected truck turned me into an accidental marriage detective, a mystery truck detective agency. So there I am, staring at this truck in my driveway like I'm some kind of parking lot security guard. My brain immediately went into full detective mode, which is hilarious because the most investigating I usually do is trying to figure out where I left my keys. But something about that vehicle just felt wrong. It was too clean, too new, and definitely too unfamiliar. I started doing that thing where you try to convince yourself everything is normal while your gut is screaming that it absolutely is not. First, I told myself maybe it belonged to a repair guy, except we hadn't called anyone for repairs. Then I thought maybe my wife had invited someone over to look at something in the house, except she would have mentioned that, right? The mental gymnastics were Olympic level at this point. I'm standing there creating elaborate scenarios where this mystery truck belonged to literally anyone except the person my paranoid brain was whispering about. The rational part of my mind kept saying, just walk through the front door like a normal human being. But the irrational part, the part that was getting louder by the second, said something was definitely off. So naturally, I decided to become James Bond in my own driveway. I'm talking full stealth mode, tiptoeing around like I'm infiltrating enemy territory instead of approaching my own house. The absurdity of sneaking around my own property wasn't lost on me, but apparently my brain had other priorities. I crept around the side of the house like some discount action hero, complete with the exaggerated careful steps and probably holding my breath for no reason. The bedroom window was open, which should have been my first clue that subtlety wasn't exactly a priority for whoever was inside. Cheaters really are the worst at being sneaky. They always leave the most obvious evidence lying around, like they want to get caught but are too cowardly to just confess. As I got closer to the window, my heart was doing this weird thing where it felt like it was trying to escape through my throat. Looking back now, all those signs I'd missed suddenly made perfect sense. The late night texting sessions, those after-work drinks that seemed to happen more and more often, and especially those free yoga lessons from her coworker. I'd actually thought it was sweet that someone was teaching her for free. Turns out I was just incredibly naive about what kind of stretching was really going on. But then I heard voices. Not just any voices, but the kind of voices that make your stomach drop straight through the floor. There's something about the tone, the intimacy, the way people sound when they think they're completely alone and safe. It's different from regular conversation. It's softer, more personal, and absolutely unmistakable when you hear it coming from your bedroom while you're supposed to be out of town. I approached that window like I was defusing a bomb. Every step felt like it took forever, and my brain kept offering me escape routes. I could just walk away right now. I could get back in my car and drive away and pretend this never happened. I could call her phone and give her a chance to end whatever was happening before I saw it. But that gut feeling, that terrible instinct that knows things before your conscious mind wants to admit them, kept pushing me forward. The window was right there and I could hear everything now. There was no more pretending, no more mental gymnastics, no more hoping I was wrong. The sounds were exactly what you think they were, and they were coming from my bed, in my bedroom, in my house. The universe really has a twisted sense of timing, doesn't it? I come home early to surprise my wife, and instead, I get the surprise of a lifetime. I looked through that window, and there they were, completely obvious, completely careless, and completely naked on the bed I sleep in every night. It was like walking in on a movie scene, except this movie was my life imploding in real time. The guy wasn't even trying to be discreet about it. No hiding cars down the street, no waiting until I was definitely gone for days, just parking right in my driveway like he owned the place. The funny thing about that moment is how your brain tries to protect you, even when it's too late. For about 3 seconds, I tried to convince myself I was seeing something else. Maybe they were just talking. Maybe they were helping each other with something. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. But reality has a way of cutting through denial pretty quickly, especially when the evidence is literally right in front of your face. I stood there for maybe 10 seconds, just processing what I was seeing. It felt longer, like time had slowed down to give me the full experience of my world falling apart. Then something clicked and I just walked away. Not dramatically, not angrily, just turned around and left. My brain had apparently decided it had seen enough for one day. Walking back to my car felt surreal. I kept expecting to wake up, or for someone to jump out and tell me this was some elaborate prank. But the truck was still there, solid and real, and mocking me from my own driveway. The neighbor who had asked me about my new truck suddenly made perfect sense. This wasn't the first time Mystery Man had parked there. Everyone probably knew except me. I peered in, and what I saw made my blood run cold. But I did the opposite of what you might expect. Instead of charging him there like some enraged husband from a bad TV drama, I made a decision that probably saved me from doing something I'd regret for the rest of my life. The Great Cabin Escape and Liquid Therapy Session. I grabbed my keys and drove straight to my family's cabin to have a complete mental breakdown in private. Because nothing says handling this maturely like running away to the woods to stare at alcohol and contemplate my life choices. The cabin was supposed to be our little weekend getaway spot, but now it felt more like a witness protection program for my sanity. I walked into that cabin and immediately spotted the emergency stash of liquor in the cabinet. A full 60-ounce bottle of rum, just sitting there like it was waiting for exactly this moment. I set it on the kitchen table and proceeded to have the most intense staring contest of my life with a piece of glass and some fermented sugar cane, torn between wanting to numb the pain and knowing I needed to think clearly. The logical part of my brain kept saying this was a terrible idea, while the emotional part was screaming that getting completely wasted was the only reasonable response to finding your wife in bed with some random guy. Part of me genuinely believed that if I drank enough rum, I could somehow think my way out of the situation. Like alcohol was going to unlock some hidden wisdom about how to handle infidelity. What really struck me was how desperately I wanted to just turn off my brain for a while. The image of what I'd seen kept replaying like a broken movie projector, and I wanted to find the off switch. Alcohol seemed like the obvious solution, except I knew that temporary numbness would just make everything worse later. The problem would still be there in the morning, except now I'd also have a hangover and possibly some drunk texting to explain. That's when I realized I was in way over my head. I'm sitting alone in a cabin, having philosophical debates with a bottle of rum, trying to figure out what to do about my cheating wife. The situation was so ridiculous that it almost felt like a bad comedy sketch. Except comedy sketches usually have better endings than real-life disasters. I started thinking about all the ways this could go wrong if I made decisions while drunk. I could drive back home and confront them both while they were still together. I could call my wife and say things that would make the situation 10 times worse. I could post something on social media that would embarrass everyone involved. I could call the guy's wife and ruin her life too, assuming he even had one. The possibilities for destruction were endless and terrifying. The funny thing about rock bottom is that it makes you realize how much further you can still fall. I was already dealing with a cheating wife, but I could easily turn this into a situation where I was dealing with a cheating wife plus assault charges, or a cheating wife plus public humiliation, or a cheating wife plus a whole bunch of other problems I hadn't even created yet. So instead of drinking myself into a stupor, I did something that felt completely insane at the time, but was probably the smartest thing I'd done all day. I turned to Reddit for advice, reaching out to complete strangers on the internet. Because apparently, when your world falls apart, the logical next step is to tell your business to thousands of people you've never met. The internet has become the world's largest support group for people having the worst day of their lives. The weirdest part about posting online was how much better it felt to just write it all down. Getting the story out of my head and onto the screen made it feel less like a nightmare and more like something that actually happened that I could maybe figure out how to deal with. It was like verbal processing, except with typing and an audience of anonymous strangers who had opinions about everything. The response was overwhelming. People were sending me advice, sharing their own stories, offering support, and basically proving that the internet isn't just a place for arguments and cat videos. There are actually decent humans out there who will take time out of their day to help someone they've never met work through a crisis. The research confirms I actually received hundreds of supportive messages, and it was exactly what I needed at that moment. I sat there reading message after message from people who had been through similar situations, and it started to feel less like I was the only person this had ever happened to. The advice ranged from practical to ridiculous to deeply thoughtful, but all of it came from people who genuinely wanted to help. Some stranger on the internet cared more about my situation than my wife apparently did. This support was so unexpected that I actually got emotional reading through all the responses. Here I was having the worst day of my life, and hundreds of people were volunteering their time to help me figure out what to do next. It gave me this weird sense of hope right when I needed it most. Maybe the world wasn't completely terrible after all. By the end of the night, I had made a decision. I was going to handle this situation without destroying myself in the process. The rum stayed unopened, the internet strangers had talked me off the ledge, and I had a plan that didn't involve doing anything I'd regret later. Sometimes the best revenge is just not making things worse for yourself. The clarity that came from that night of processing was exactly what I needed. I wasn't going to let my emotions drive me into making stupid decisions. Instead, I was going to be strategic about this whole mess. And as I sat there in that cabin staring at the unopened bottle of rum, I realized I had the perfect opportunity to turn this disaster into something that might actually work in my favor. Brother's fishing trip therapy and romantic sweet switcheroo. The next morning, I woke up with what I thought was a brilliant plan. We had this romantic weekend trip, booked at some fancy vineyard B&B with a couple suite, and my wife was expecting to go. But here's where it gets interesting. I called her from the cabin and told her work needed me to stay another few days to finish up a project. The lie rolled off my tongue so smoothly, it was almost scary. She sounded disappointed, which would have been touching if I didn't know exactly why she wanted me out of town so badly. Then she did something that was so predictable, it was almost insulting to my intelligence. She suggested that maybe her best friend could come with her instead, so the trip wouldn't go to waste. Her best friend. The same best friend who had been conveniently unavailable every time I tried to plan double dates lately. The same best friend who apparently had a very flexible schedule when it came to last-minute romantic getaways. The audacity was genuinely impressive. I told her that sounded like a great idea, that I'd already paid for everything anyway, so she should definitely go and have fun. The enthusiasm in my voice was probably a little over the top, but she didn't seem to notice. She was too busy texting someone while we were talking. I could hear the little notification sounds going off in the background. 3 guesses who she was coordinating with, and the first 2 that don't count. But here's where my evil genius kicked in. Instead of letting her and her mystery truck owner enjoy a romantic weekend on my dime, I made a different call. I contacted my brother and told him I needed some serious family support and that I had a paid vacation we could turn into a fishing trip. My brother, being the kind of guy who asks questions later and shows up first, was all in. We drove to that B&B together, checked into the couple's suite with 2 beds, and spent the weekend talking through my situation while taking advantage of the lake and boat rentals. The look on the B&B staff's faces when 2 guys showed up to check into the romantic couples package was priceless. They kept asking if we were sure we were in the right place, and we kept assuring them that yes, we were exactly where we needed to be. The staff actually repurposed the romantic package for 2 brothers, complete with rose petals in the beds and little chocolate hearts everywhere. We ate the chocolates, used the champagne to celebrate my newfound freedom, and got on with our therapeutic weekend. Meanwhile, my wife was blowing up my phone with increasingly frantic messages about how her best friend couldn't make it after all, and asking if I could somehow get away from work to join her. The desperation in her texts was almost funny. She went from casual suggestion to full panic mode in about 6 hours. Apparently, her backup plan for the backup plan had fallen through, and she was left with a romantic weekend for one. The timing of her messages was perfect. She'd text me right around the times when normal people would be having romantic dinners or enjoying couples activities. It was like she had a schedule for when she was supposed to be doing romantic things with someone who wasn't me. And when those plans fell through, she remembered she had a husband she could try to manipulate into filling the slot. My brother found the whole situation hilarious. He kept making jokes about how we were probably the first siblings to turn a couple suite into fishing headquarters. My brother had gone through a divorce a few years earlier, so he understood the emotional roller coaster I was riding. He offered solid counsel about making smart decisions instead of satisfying ones, and that support meant everything. The funniest part was watching my wife's story change in real time through her text messages. First, her best friend was definitely coming, and they were going to have such a great girls' weekend. Then her best friend was feeling under the weather, but would probably still make it. Then her best friend had a family emergency and couldn't come at all. Then maybe I could get away from work just for one night. Then maybe we could reschedule the whole thing for when I was available. Each message was more transparent than the last. She was clearly scrambling to salvage whatever romantic plan she'd made, and every backup option was failing spectacularly. The guy with the mystery truck was probably sitting at home wondering why his weekend getaway had suddenly evaporated. I imagined him checking his phone every few minutes, waiting for updates that never came. By Sunday, she had moved into full bargaining mode. She was offering to drive up to where I was supposedly working so we could at least have dinner together. She was suggesting we could do a short weekend trip the following weekend instead. She was basically throwing out every possible scenario that would get us alone together in a romantic setting. The desperation was so obvious it was almost embarrassing. The satisfaction of completely disrupting her plans without her even knowing it was incredible. She thought she was dealing with work conflicts and bad timing. She had no idea that her husband was deliberately sabotaging her affair schedule while getting the emotional support he needed to figure out his next move. The petty revenge felt almost too easy. My brother and I drove home Sunday evening with a cooler full of fish and a solid plan for how I was going to handle the situation. The weekend had given me the space to think clearly and the support to feel confident about my decisions. Plus, I'd successfully prevented her from enjoying a romantic getaway with her affair partner while gaining valuable thinking time. She was waiting for me when I got home, full of stories about how lonely and boring her solo weekend had been. The performance was Academy Award worthy, but what I didn't know was that while I was off processing my feelings like a mature adult, other family members had decided to take matters into their own hands. The sister-in-law turns professional stalker. My sister-in-law, Jen, had apparently decided to launch her own personal investigation unit. I came home to find out that my family had basically turned into a crime-solving team without telling me. Jen had taken it upon herself to figure out exactly what was going on, and her methods were both impressive and slightly terrifying. She started by doing what any reasonable person would do when they suspect a brother-in-law's wife is cheating. She began following my wife around like some kind of discount private investigator. The dedication was honestly remarkable. Jen had apparently cleared her schedule to become a full-time surveillance specialist, and she was taking this more seriously than actual detectives and take actual cases. The funny thing about affairs is how they turn everyone in the family into amateur sleuths. Suddenly, every family member becomes convinced they need to gather evidence and solve the mystery. It's like Infidelity activates some kind of detective gene that makes ordinary people think they're qualified to conduct undercover operations. Jen had fully embraced this role and was treating it like her new career. She told me she'd been watching the house on days when I was supposed to be out of town. The mystery truck had become a regular fixture in my driveway, showing up with clockwork precision whenever my work schedule took me away. Jen documented his visits and discovered he had a wife and kids. The affair partner wasn't just some random single guy. He was married with a family. The revelation that this guy had his own wife and kids at home made the whole situation 10 times more complicated and 10 times more infuriating. My wife wasn't just betraying me. She was helping someone else betray their entire family. The collateral damage was expanding beyond what I'd even considered, and Jen was documenting all of it with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found their true calling. But Jen didn't stop at casual observation. She decided to follow this guy to see where he lived and what his situation was. The level of commitment was both admirable and slightly concerning. She spent entire afternoons trailing him through town, learning his routine, and basically becoming his unwanted shadow. The guy had no idea he was being stalked by someone's determined sister-in-law. During one of these surveillance missions, Jen discovered the apartment complex where he lived. She watched him go into a unit that clearly wasn't set up for a single person. There were family photos visible through the windows, kids' toys in the yard, and a woman who came home later that evening. Everything clicked into place about why he was so comfortable parking in my driveway like he owned the place. Jen's detective work reached its peak when she managed to get photographic evidence. She'd positioned herself strategically to capture my wife and her affair partner together, and the pictures were absolutely damning. Not subtle, not ambiguous, but clear proof that there was no innocent explanation for any of this. The photos showed them acting like a couple, completely comfortable and obviously familiar with each other. The evidence was so overwhelming that it left no room for doubt or denial. When Jen showed me these pictures, my mixed feelings about her unsolicited investigation suddenly became very clear. Part of me was grateful that someone cared enough to get involved and help me understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. Part of me was embarrassed that my personal crisis had become a family project. And part of me was impressed by her thoroughness and dedication to uncovering the truth. The awkward thing about having family members investigate your spouse is that it removes any last shred of privacy from an already humiliating situation. Jen knew details about my wife's affair that I didn't know. She'd spent more time observing my wife's behavior than I had, and she could tell me things about my own marriage that I'd been too trusting to notice. It was helpful and mortifying at the same time, but the photographic evidence was the final piece I needed to accept that there was no going back from this. Seeing my wife with another man in pictures made it impossible to maintain any hope that this was just a temporary mistake or a moment of poor judgment. The images showed two people who were clearly involved in something ongoing and serious. What struck me most about Jen's findings was how obvious everything had been to everyone except me. The affair partner's regular visits, the timing that coincided with my work trips, the way my wife's behavior had changed over the past few months. All the signs had been there for anyone who was paying attention, and apparently everyone had been paying attention except the person who should have been. The pictures also revealed how careless both of them had been about hiding their relationship. They were acting like they had nothing to worry about, like they were completely safe from discovery. The guy was parking in my driveway in broad daylight, and my wife was greeting him at the front door like they were an established couple. The lack of concern about getting caught was almost insulting. Looking at those photos, I realized that the confrontation I'd been avoiding was inevitable. There was no more room for doubt, no more hoping I was wrong, no more trying to find innocent explanations. Jen's amateur detective work had provided me with irrefutable proof that my marriage was over. The only question left was how I was going to handle ending it. The funny thing about cheaters is that they never realize how obvious they are to everyone around them. But even with all this evidence staring me in the face, I still wasn't ready to have that conversation. Apparently, my family had noticed my continued avoidance and decided I needed a different dinner party, except Sharon sprung a casual pasta dinner that turned into therapy. The setup was so obvious it was almost insulting, but I was too emotionally exhausted to put up much resistance to their amateur intervention tactics. I walked into that dinner expecting normal conversation about work and weekend plans, but instead found myself sitting across from a woman who was clearly trained to read people's emotional states like a roadmap. Sharon had this way of asking casual questions that weren't casual at all, and before I knew it, I was spilling details about my situation between bites of pasta. The whole thing felt like being ambushed by someone's therapeutic aunt who happened to have a psychology degree. The resistance I felt toward getting professional help was intense and completely irrational. Part of me kept insisting that I could figure this out on my own, that I didn't need some stranger analyzing my marriage problems and telling me what to do. Another part of me recognized that I was drowning in emotions and had no idea how to process any of what was happening. The internal conflict between wanting help and rejecting it was exhausting all by itself. After dinner, Sharon suggested we take her dog for a walk so we could talk more privately. The absurdity of having impromptu therapy while following a golden retriever around the neighborhood wasn't lost on me, but something about the informal setting made it easier to open up. There's something about walking that makes difficult conversations feel less confrontational. Like the movement gives your brain permission to process things differently. What surprised me most was how much I needed to talk to someone who wasn't emotionally invested in my situation. Sharon just listened without immediately jumping to conclusions or telling me what I should feel about everything. The neutrality was refreshing in a way I hadn't expected, and she forced me to face the inevitable conversation I'd been avoiding. I found myself telling her things I hadn't even admitted to myself yet. How I'd been noticing small changes in my wife's behavior for months, but convincing myself they didn't mean anything. How I'd been making excuses for her distance and distraction because facing the alternative was too scary. How part of me had known something was wrong long before I saw actual proof, but I'd been too afraid to investigate my own suspicions. She kept bringing the conversation back to the inevitable confrontation with my wife that I was desperately trying to avoid. Every time I'd start talking about other aspects of the situation, she'd redirect me to the fact that I needed to have an honest conversation about what I knew and what I wanted to happen next. The woman had laser focus when it came to cutting through avoidance tactics. Her advice was brutally simple and terrifying at the same time. She said, the longer I waited to confront my wife, the more difficult the conversation would become, and that clarity was essential for moving forward. The logic was sound, but the emotional reality of actually having that conversation felt impossible. I kept trying to find ways around it, alternative approaches that didn't involve direct confrontation. I suggested maybe I could just gather more evidence first, or maybe I could figure out a way to make her confess without having to bring up what I already knew. Sharon listened to all my elaborate schemes to avoid the hard conversation, and then gently pointed out that I was essentially trying to outsmart my own fear. The observation was accurate and slightly embarrassing. The comedy of my avoidance tactics became obvious when she started listing them back to me. I wanted to wait until I felt emotionally ready, except I'd never feel ready for that conversation. I wanted to have more information first, except I already had all the information I needed. I wanted to plan out exactly what to say, except no amount of planning would make the conversation less painful. She made me realize that I was treating the confrontation like some kind of performance that I needed to perfect instead of just an honest conversation between two people who used to love each other. The fear of not handling it perfectly was preventing me from handling it at all. I was so worried about saying the wrong thing that I wasn't saying anything, which was actually the worst possible approach. The emotional stakes of facing the truth felt overwhelming, but Sharon helped me understand that avoiding the truth wasn't making those stakes any lower. If anything, the longer I waited, the more complicated and painful everything became. The fear was growing instead of shrinking, and my confidence was disappearing instead of building up over time. She pointed out something that should have been obvious, but wasn't. People will do absolutely anything to avoid difficult conversations, even when avoiding them creates more problems than having them would. I was spending more energy trying not to confront my wife than it would take to actually confront her. The math didn't make sense, but the emotional logic felt completely reasonable. By the end of our walk, Sharon had made her position crystal clear. It was now or never. No more delays, no more excuses, no more elaborate plans to avoid the inevitable. The conversation needed to happen immediately before I could talk myself out of it again or find new reasons to postpone what had to be done. Her final piece of advice was that clarity comes from facing reality, not from trying to manage or control it. The truth about my marriage was already there whether I acknowledged it or not. The only question was whether I was going to keep pretending or start dealing with what was actually happening. Walking back to my brother's house, I felt something I hadn't felt since finding that truck in my driveway. I felt like I had a plan that made sense, even if it was terrifying. But apparently my paranoid brain had other ideas about how this confrontation should go down. The great grocery store stakeout. Armed with Sharon's therapeutic wisdom and a plan that made sense, I drove home ready to have the conversation that would change everything. But first, my wife told me she was going to the grocery store. Such a simple, innocent statement that should have meant absolutely nothing. Except when trust is completely destroyed, even the most mundane activities become potential sources of deception. The rational part of my mind kept saying this was ridiculous. She's going to buy food. People do this every day. It's a normal human activity that doesn't require verification or investigation. But the paranoid part of my brain, the part that had been activated by finding naked strangers in my bedroom, was screaming that nothing she said could be trusted anymore. If she could lie about loving me while carrying on an affair, she could certainly lie about picking up milk and bread. I even trailed her to the grocery store because nothing felt safe anymore. The absurdity of conducting surveillance on my wife's shopping trip wasn't lost on me, but I couldn't trust anything she said. There was her car, exactly where it should be if she was actually buying groceries. Relief and embarrassment washed over me in equal measure. She was telling the truth about this one simple thing, which somehow made me feel worse. The fact that I needed visual confirmation of her grocery store visit highlighted just how completely broken our relationship had become. The irony was almost funny in a dark way. I didn't trust her about groceries after catching her cheating. The progression from discovering infidelity to verifying food shopping was so absurd it felt like something out of a comedy sketch. Except it wasn't funny when you were living it. It was just sad and pathetic and a perfect example of how betrayal turns you into someone you don't recognize. When she finally emerged from the store with actual grocery bags, I felt a mixture of relief and disgust with myself. She was buying groceries. She was telling the truth about this one insignificant thing. But the fact that I needed to verify it showed me just how far we'd fallen. Every future interaction would be filtered through suspicion and doubt. Every casual statement would be potential evidence of more deception. The drive home felt like a walk of shame. I just spent time conducting surveillance on my wife's shopping trip, and the only thing I'd accomplished was confirming that sometimes she actually does what she says she's going to do. The behavior was beneath me, beneath us, and beneath any relationship that had any hope of surviving. But that was the point. Our relationship didn't have any hope of surviving, and my grocery store stakeout was just more evidence of that reality. I got home before she did, and that's when I sent her the text that changed everything. I told her we needed to talk when she got back and that she needed to be ready to be honest. The message was deliberately vague and ominous, designed to let her know that whatever conversation we were about to have was going to be different from all the others. The days of casual deception and comfortable lies were over. The cryptic nature of the text was intentional. I wanted her to have time to think about what honesty meant and what she might need to confess. I wanted her to wonder what I knew and how much trouble she was in. After weeks of her controlling the narrative through lies and misdirection, it was time for me to take back some control of the situation. Watching her read that text when she got home was interesting. The casual expression on her face shifted to something more concerned as she processed the message. She asked what I wanted to talk about, and I told her she'd find out soon enough. The power dynamic had shifted, and she could feel it. The grocery store verification. It had been ridiculous and degrading, but it had served a purpose. It showed me that trust wasn't something we could rebuild or repair. It was something that was completely gone, and without it, we had nothing left worth fighting for. The paranoia that had driven me to follow her to buy milk was the same paranoia that would poison every interaction we'd ever have again. But I was done being the suspicious husband who needed to verify grocery trips. I was done being the victim who discovered betrayal and then spent his time gathering more evidence of what he already knew. The conversation we were about to have would determine whether she was capable of honesty, and if she wasn't, then I already knew what came next. The text message had been sent, the stage was set, and my wife was about to find out that her husband was no longer the trusting man who believed whatever she told him. She was about to discover that some conversations can't be avoided forever, and this was one of them. The trickle-truth comedy show. When we sat down to have our conversation, my wife launched into what I now recognize as the classic cheater's playbook, the trickle-truth method, where they reveal information one tiny piece at a time, testing your reaction before deciding how much more they need to confess. It's like watching someone try to ease into a cold swimming pool, except the pool is made of lies and the water temperature is your marriage falling apart. She started with the most innocent possible explanation for everything I might have noticed. She'd been skipping yoga classes lately because she was feeling stressed and needed time to think. The yoga excuse was almost insulting in its simplicity. as if missing exercise classes was the biggest secret she'd been keeping from me. I sat there, listening to her explain her workout schedule, while knowing I'd seen her naked in bed with another man. The disconnect between what she was telling me and what I actually knew was so absurd it was almost funny. When I didn't seem satisfied with the yoga revelation, she moved on to phase 2 of her confession strategy. She admitted that instead of going to yoga, she'd been going out for drinks occasionally. Just casual drinks to decompress after work, nothing serious, just sitting at a bar by herself, thinking about life. The image she was painting was of a woman having some kind of mild midlife crisis that involved skipping exercise and having solitary cocktails. Each new piece of information was designed to seem like a big confession, while actually revealing nothing significant. She was controlling the narrative, deciding how much truth I could handle at each stage. The manipulation was so obvious once you recognized the pattern, but she was delivering each revelation like it was this huge admission that took tremendous courage to share. But then I mentioned the photo. The one I'd found in her deleted gallery, showing her with some stranger looking very comfortable and definitely not alone. Her face went through this interesting series of expressions as she tried to figure out how much I actually knew and how much she could still get away with hiding. The calculation was visible as she weighed her options for explaining away photographic evidence. Her explanation for the photo was so ridiculous it bordered on comedy. She said she'd been out having drinks and some guy had asked her to take a picture with him, and she'd agreed because she was being stupid. According to her version, this was just a random stranger who wanted a photo with her for no apparent reason, and she'd gone along with it because she wasn't thinking clearly. The story made no sense on any level, but she delivered it with complete conviction. The progression from yoga lies to drinking alone to mysterious photos was like watching someone slowly admit to increasingly serious crimes. Each confession was supposed to be the complete truth, but each one was immediately followed by evidence that there was more she wasn't telling me. The pattern became predictable. She confessed to something minor. I'd pressed for more details, and she'd act shocked that I wasn't satisfied with her partial honesty. What frustrated me most was how she seemed to think she could control the amount of damage by controlling the flow of information. Like if she only admitted to small things gradually, the impact would be manageable and she could gauge my reactions before deciding whether to reveal more. She was treating our marriage like a negotiation where she got to decide which facts I was allowed to know. Every time I threatened to leave unless she told me everything, she'd suddenly remember one more detail she'd forgotten to mention. It was never the complete truth, just enough additional information to keep me from walking out the door. The manipulation was exhausting. She was making me work for every piece of honesty, forcing me to drag the truth out of her bit by bit instead of just telling me what had happened. The universal experience of being trickle-truth is something that anyone who's dealt with infidelity recognizes immediately. The gradual disclosure, the minimizing of each revelation, the acting like each small confession is this huge gesture of honesty. It's a playbook that cheaters seem to follow instinctively, probably because it gives them the illusion of maintaining some control over a situation where they've already lost all moral authority. After the third or fourth round of "that's everything I swear," followed immediately by more confessions when I pressed harder, I realized what was happening. She was never going to voluntarily tell me the whole truth. She was going to keep feeding me information in tiny doses, always holding back the worst parts until I specifically asked about them. The game was designed to make me the villain for not being satisfied with partial honesty. That's when I stopped playing along. I told her I knew about the affair, I knew who she was seeing, and I knew she was lying about the extent of it. The look on her face when she realized her careful information management strategy had failed was almost worth the months of deception I'd endured. I thought I'd heard every lie until she dropped the bomb I never saw coming. When she finally started telling me the real story, something inside me completely broke down. The panic attack and cold water reality check. The physical reaction hit me like a freight train. The room started shrinking around me while my heart hammered against my ribs so hard I could hear it in my ears. Suddenly, there were voices everywhere, even though only 2 people were talking. I recognized what was happening because I'd heard people describe panic attacks before, but experiencing one while your wife confesses to months of infidelity is a special kind of nightmare. My brain was trying to process the words coming out of her mouth while my body was convinced we were under immediate physical threat. The disconnect between what was actually happening and what my nervous system thought was happening was almost comical. If you could find humor in your life imploding in real time. The dizziness hit me hard, and I realized I needed to get out of that room before I either passed out or did something stupid. I mumbled something about needing a minute and stumbled to the bathroom like a drunk person trying to navigate a tilted ship. The absurdity of having a medical emergency during a marriage crisis wasn't lost on me, but my body apparently didn't care about the timing of its dramatic breakdown. I splashed cold water on my face, remembering something I had read in those Reddit comments about grounding techniques during panic attacks. The shock of the cold hit my system and somehow convinced my brain to stop spinning long enough for me to remember how to breathe properly. I stood there gripping the bathroom sink, watching water drip off my face in the mirror, thinking about how ridiculous it was that discovering your spouse's affair comes with its own physical symptoms. The cold water trick actually worked, not just something actors do for dramatic effect. The sensation gives your nervous system something else to focus on besides the fact that your world is ending. I splashed more water on my face and my wrists, trying to reset whatever internal alarm system was convinced I was dying. The bathroom became my temporary safe space where I could have a breakdown without an audience. I caught my reflection and knew I'd never look at us the same way again. I looked exactly the same as I had an hour earlier, but everything had changed. The person staring back at me was someone whose wife had been cheating for months. Someone whose marriage was over, someone who was about to have to figure out how to rebuild his entire life. But I still looked like the same guy who had been worried about grocery store visits and planning confrontation strategies. After a few minutes of cold water therapy and breathing exercises I'd never needed before, I felt stable enough to go back and finish the conversation. The determination to get the complete truth was stronger than the physical reaction to hearing it. I wasn't going to let a panic attack prevent me from finally understanding what had been happening in my own marriage. Walking back into that living room felt like entering a courtroom where I was both the prosecutor and the victim. My wife was sitting exactly where I'd left her, probably wondering if I was having some kind of breakdown in the bathroom, which I was, but I wasn't going to let that derail the most important conversation of my life. She immediately started trying to minimize everything she'd just told me, as if the physical reaction I just had proved that she should have kept lying to protect my feelings. The logic was fascinating and infuriating at the same time. She'd caused the problem by having an affair, but now she was concerned about the emotional impact of telling me about it. The backward reasoning was almost impressive in its complete lack of self-awareness. Her attempts to downplay the affair after watching me nearly collapse from the shock of it showed how completely disconnected she was from the reality of what she'd done. She kept using phrases like, "It didn't mean anything, and it just happened," as if months of deliberate deception could be explained away with casual dismissals. The minimizing was almost more insulting than the original betrayal because it showed she still didn't understand the magnitude of what she destroyed. I found myself getting angry at her reaction to my panic attack instead of feeling embarrassed about having one. She seemed to think my physical response was proof that I was too fragile to handle the truth rather than evidence of how devastating her actions had been. The complete inability to connect her choices with their consequences was mind-boggling. Cheaters apparently never realize that their actions have physical and emotional consequences that extend far beyond just hurting feelings. They think betrayal is just an emotional problem that can be solved with apologies and promises, not a trauma that affects every system in your body. The disconnect between the damage they cause and their understanding of that damage is staggering. By the time my heart rate returned to normal and the room stopped spinning, I had reached a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I told her she had one chance to tell me absolutely everything with complete honesty, or I was walking out the door and never coming back. The ultimatum wasn't dramatic posturing or an attempt to scare her into compliance. It was a simple statement of fact about what I needed to move forward. The panic attack had actually clarified something important for me. My body's reaction to her confession had shown me that staying in this marriage was literally making me sick. The choice between demanding complete truth and walking away permanently wasn't really a choice at all. She was about to respond when something happened that felt like the universe had decided our conversation needed even more chaos. The affair partner's epic phone fail. Right in the middle of this emotional hurricane, my wife's phone starts ringing. The timing was so perfect, it felt like the universe was playing some kind of cosmic joke on us. She looked at the phone, and I could see her face change completely. The caller ID was showing a name I didn't recognize, but her reaction told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't some random telemarketer interrupting our marriage crisis. This was him. Without even thinking about it, I reached over and grabbed the phone before she could answer it. The move was so quick and instinctive that she didn't have time to react. I hit the answer button and said hello in the most casual voice I could manage, like I was just some guy answering his wife's phone on a normal Tuesday evening. The silence on the other end was immediate and telling. After a few seconds of dead air, I heard this guy's voice asking for my wife by name. The tone was familiar and comfortable, like someone who'd made this call many times before. There was an intimacy to how he said her name that made my stomach turn. This wasn't someone calling about a work emergency or asking for directions. This was someone who knew her well enough to expect she'd answer her personal phone at 9 o'clock at night. I could have handed the phone over to her and let them have their conversation while I listened. I could have pretended to be someone else and tried to gather more information. Instead, I decided to go with the direct approach that seemed to be working so well for me lately. I told him exactly who I was. I said I was her husband and asked who he was calling for. The reaction was immediate and hilarious. He stammered something about having the wrong number and tried to hang up before I could respond. The guy had been comfortable enough to carry on an affair with my wife for months, but the second he had to deal with me directly, he turned into a scared teenager trying to escape detention. I wasn't about to let him off the hook that easily. I called him back immediately and told him we needed to talk. The conversation that followed was like watching someone try to dig themselves out of a hole while simultaneously making it deeper. He kept insisting that nothing had happened between them, that they were just friends, that I was misunderstanding the situation. The lies were so transparent they were almost insulting to both our intelligence. What struck me most about his denials was how predictable they were. Every affair partner seems to follow the same script when they get caught. First, they claim it's all a misunderstanding. Then they admit something happened but insist it wasn't serious. Then they try to minimize their responsibility and blame everyone else for the situation. This guy was hitting every note in the cheater's handbook with perfect accuracy. When it became clear that his denial strategy wasn't working, he switched to bargaining mode. He started talking about how sorry he was and how it had all been a mistake. The remorse seemed genuine until I realized he was only sorry about getting caught, not about what he'd been doing. He was worried about consequences, not about the damage he'd helped cause to 2 marriages. The conversation took an interesting turn when I started asking him about his own situation at home. He'd been so focused on damage control that he forgot I might be curious about his family status. When I asked if he was married, the pause before his answer told me everything I needed to know. He eventually admitted he had a wife, but immediately started explaining why she didn't need to know about any of this. His reasoning for keeping his wife in the dark was fascinating and infuriating at the same time. According to him, telling her would just cause unnecessary pain for everyone involved. The affair was over now that they had been caught, so there was no point in destroying his marriage too. The logic was completely self-serving, but he presented it like he was being noble and protecting people's feelings. I found his concern for his wife's emotional well-being particularly rich, considering he'd been cheating on her for months without any apparent regard for those same feelings. The selective empathy was impressive. He could rationalize betraying her when it served his purposes, but suddenly became protective when facing consequences. What really got to me was his assumption that he could negotiate his way out of the situation. He seemed to think that if he apologized enough and promised it would never happen again, we could all just pretend none of this had ever happened. The entitlement was staggering. He'd helped destroy my marriage, but somehow expected to escape without any damage to his own. That's when I made a decision that felt both satisfying and terrifying. I told him that if my wife was going to face the consequences of her choices, then fairness demanded that his wife know what had been happening too. The equality of disclosure seemed like basic justice. If affairs destroy marriages, then all the marriages involved should face the same level of honesty and consequences. His reaction to that statement was immediate panic. He started pleading with me not to tell his wife, promising he would handle it himself when the time was right. The time would never be right, obviously, because people who cheat don't voluntarily confess unless they absolutely have to. He was asking me to trust him to do the right thing, which was particularly amusing given that he'd just spent months doing the wrong thing with my wife. The desperation in his voice when he realized I wasn't going to protect his secret was almost satisfying. For the first time in this whole situation, someone who'd been comfortable operating in shadows was being forced into the light. The fear of exposure that he was experiencing was probably similar to what I'd felt when I first saw that truck in my driveway, except he had actually done something wrong. I told him he had a choice. He could tell his wife himself, or I would make sure she found out another way. Either option worked for me, but I wasn't going to be the only spouse dealing with the aftermath of their choices. The conversation ended with him begging for time to figure out how to handle his situation. But I'd already decided that equal consequences were the only fair option. Little did he know, after giving the affair partner his ultimatum, I decided I wasn't going to wait around to see if he'd actually tell his wife the truth. The guy had already proven he was comfortable lying to everyone in his life, so trusting him to suddenly develop integrity seemed like a terrible strategy. Instead, I came up with what felt like the perfect solution. I was going to make my wife call his wife directly and explain the situation herself. The look on my wife's face when I told her what she was going to do was priceless. She immediately started protesting that it wasn't her responsibility to destroy someone else's marriage. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. She'd been perfectly comfortable helping to destroy someone else's marriage when she was sleeping with the guy, but suddenly she was concerned about causing emotional damage to his wife. The selective morality was fascinating to watch in real time. I handed her the phone and told her to call Karen at work. She kept trying to negotiate her way out of it, suggesting that maybe we should wait a few days or let the guy handle it himself or find some gentler way to break the news. Every excuse was designed to avoid taking responsibility for what she'd done. She wanted to maintain the comfortable fiction that affairs only affect the people directly involved, not the innocent spouses who get dragged into the mess. The stalling tactics were almost comical. She suddenly became very concerned about this woman's feelings and emotional well-being. The same feelings she'd been completely ignoring while carrying on an affair with the woman's husband. She kept asking if I was sure this was the right thing to do, as if there was some ethical handbook for how to handle discovering your spouse's infidelity that she was suddenly interested in consulting. When she finally made the call, I could hear the phone ringing through the speaker. Karen answered with a cheerful hello, clearly not expecting her workday to include a phone call that would change her entire life. The contrast between her normal, professional voice and what she was about to learn made the whole situation feel even more tragic and absurd. My wife introduced herself using her full name, which meant nothing to the woman on the other end of the phone. There was this awkward pause while Karen tried to figure out why some stranger was calling her at work. The confusion in her voice was obvious as she asked how she could help, probably thinking this was some kind of business call or wrong number situation. Then my wife started explaining who she was and why she was calling. The explanation was painful to listen to. She kept stumbling over the words, trying to find some gentle way to tell this woman that her husband had been cheating with her for months. There's really no soft way to deliver that kind of news, but watching my wife try to minimize the damage while being forced to confess was almost entertaining. Karen's reaction went through several distinct phases. First was confusion, then disbelief, then a kind of stunned silence that lasted long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. You could hear her processing the information, trying to make sense of what she was being told. The silence was broken by her asking my wife to repeat what she just said, like maybe she'd misheard something important. When the reality started sinking in, Karen's voice changed completely. The professional politeness disappeared, replaced by something raw and furious. She started asking pointed questions about how long this had been going on and how my wife could do this to another woman. The questions were fair and brutal, and my wife had no good answers for any of them. What struck me during this phone call was how affairs always impact way more people than the cheaters ever consider. This woman had been going about her normal workday when she got a call that destroyed her sense of reality. She hadn't done anything wrong, but she was suddenly dealing with the consequences of choices other people had made behind her back. The ripple effect was immediate and devastating. Right in the middle of this conversation, Karen mentioned that her husband had been texting her frantically. It was obviously the affair partner trying to reach her, probably panicking because he'd figured out what was happening. The timing was perfect. While his wife was learning the truth from my wife, he was desperately trying to do damage control from wherever he was hiding. When the call finally ended, both women were crying for completely different reasons. My wife was crying because she was facing consequences for her actions. Karen was crying because her marriage had just been destroyed by people she'd never met. The inequality of their situations wasn't lost on me. Within minutes of hanging up, my phone started buzzing with angry text messages from the affair partner. He was furious that his wife now knew the truth, and he was blaming me for ruining his life. The complete lack of self-awareness was stunning. He'd helped ruin my marriage, but somehow I was the villain for making sure his wife knew what kind of person she was married to. The satisfaction of ensuring equal consequences for everyone involved was intense and immediate. But apparently, dumping this bombshell on an innocent spouse had elevated the drama to a whole new level because my wife was about to discover that her problems were just getting started. The desperate bargaining circus. The phone call aftermath triggered my wife's transformation into full damage control mode. The shift was immediate and almost impressive in its desperation. She went from someone who had been caught red-handed to someone who suddenly had a 12-point plan for saving our marriage. The speed with which she moved from confession mode to negotiation mode was like watching someone flip a switch from guilty to salesperson. Her first offer was couples counseling. She said we could start immediately, that she'd already looked up therapists in our area, and that she was willing to do whatever it took to make this work. The enthusiasm was remarkable considering that just hours earlier she'd been lying about every aspect of her life. She presented counseling like it was this brilliant solution that would magically fix everything, as if months of deliberate deception could be undone with a few therapy sessions. What struck me most was how textbook all of her responses were. Every offer, every promise, every dramatic gesture was exactly what you expect from someone who'd been caught cheating and was trying to avoid consequences. It was like she was reading from a script titled How to Save Your Marriage After Getting Caught Having an Affair. The predictability was almost insulting. Then came the sexual favors. She started making promises about our physical relationship that were so over the top they felt like something out of a bad movie. The idea that she could somehow compete with her affair partner by offering more of what she'd already been giving to someone else was deeply disturbing. She was treating intimacy like a bargaining chip in a negotiation rather than something that requires trust and emotional connection. The dark amusement I felt watching her cycle through these desperate offers was probably not healthy, but it was definitely present. There was something almost comical about how she thought she could purchase her way out of this situation with promises and activities. Like infidelity was just a customer service problem that could be resolved with the right combination of apologies and incentives. Her shock when she realized how much I already knew and had planned was the most genuine emotion I'd seen from her all day. She'd been operating under the assumption that she still had some control over the situation, that she could manage the narrative and influence my decisions. The discovery that I've been several steps ahead of her the entire time was clearly devastating to her sense of agency. When I told her I'd already booked my own counseling sessions, her face went through this interesting series of expressions. She'd been planning to use therapy as a way to control the conversation and manage the process of reconciliation. Finding out that I'd already taken that step independently meant she couldn't use it as leverage or proof of her commitment to change. The revelation that I'd already secured alternative living arrangements through company housing hit her even harder. She'd been counting on logistics to keep me trapped in the situation while we worked through her proposed repair strategies. The knowledge that I could leave immediately without having to figure out where to go or how to afford it stripped away one of her major sources of leverage. Each piece of information about my preparation was like watching someone realize they'd been playing a game where the other person already knew all the rules and had been planning their moves for weeks. The strategic thinking that had gone into my response to her affair was something she clearly hadn't anticipated. She'd expected emotional chaos and impulsive decisions, not calculated preparation and logical planning. When she finally understood that none of her offers were going to work, she shifted into full theatrical mode. The breakdown was dramatic and designed to evoke guilt and sympathy. She started talking about how she didn't deserve to live, how she'd ruined everything, how she couldn't bear the thought of losing me. The performance was so over the top, it felt like watching someone audition for a soap opera. The manipulation tactics were so obvious once you recognized them for what they were. The self-deprecating comments were designed to make me feel sorry for her. The dramatic claims about not being able to survive without me were meant to make me feel responsible for her emotional well-being. The whole display was carefully crafted to shift focus from what she'd done to how much she was suffering because of the consequences. What really struck me about her theatrical breakdown was how it proved she still didn't understand what she'd actually done wrong. She was sorry about getting caught and facing consequences, but there was no real acknowledgement of the betrayal itself. The tears were for her situation, not for the damage she'd caused to our relationship. The manipulation playbook that exposed cheaters follow is apparently universal. The bargaining, the promises, the dramatic emotional displays, the attempts to control the narrative through guilt and sympathy. Every move was predictable because every cheater seems to follow the same basic script when their deception is discovered. By the time she'd exhausted all her strategies and realized none of them were working, I was already walking toward the door with my bags packed. The clean exit I'd planned was possible because I'd anticipated every move she'd made and prepared accordingly. The support systems were in place, the logistics were handled, and the decision was final. Her grand gestures weren't the solution. I'd already closed the door. What happened next taught me something important about how actions create consequences that ripple far beyond what anyone expects. The strategic approach worked because I stopped reacting with pure emotion and started thinking several moves ahead. I went from being the guy who got blindsided by betrayal to someone who refused to let cheaters control the narrative. When I made my wife call his wife directly, I wasn't just exposing the affair, I was ensuring both marriages faced the same consequences. That felt like real justice. What nobody tells you about situations like this is how taking back control of your story changes everything. Instead of being the victim who discovered betrayal, I became the person who decided what happened next. The affair partner thought he could keep his perfect life while helping destroy mine. Making sure his wife knew the truth leveled the playing field completely. If you've got your own crazy revenge stories or ways you've taken back control when someone tried to screw you over, drop them in the comments. Sometimes the best therapy is knowing you're not the only one who refused to just take it lying down.